Accelerated learning binaural beats. Listen to these seismic guidelines to review for the California Supplemental exam. Ensure you consult the up-to-date version of the Field Act, Essential Services Building Seismic Safety Act, Alquist-Priolo Act, Alquist-Priolo Hospital Facilities Seismic Safety Act, and Chapter 16, Section 1613 of the CBC on earthquake loads. The intent of this recording is to capture an overview of seismic-related information covered across several acts and codes in California. Play the audio before you sleep or when you wake up in a relaxed state. Repeat the code guideline and use your imagination to apply it to what you already know. Let this learning tool guide you, knowing you will succeed. Let's begin. Field Act for School Facility Approvals, per the Education Code, Articles 3 and 6. The Field Act is under the Education Code. The Education Code is one of 29 codes and legislative laws in California. What is the Field Act? The Field Act is a law that provides seismic design standards, plan review, construction inspections, and special tests under the division of the state architect. The goal is to provide earthquake-resistant design and construction of all public schools. It governs K through 14 public schools, that is, public primary, secondary, and community colleges. It requires inspectors approved by DSA to inspect construction and verify compliance with approved plans. Whose jurisdiction is the Field Act part of? The Field Act is under the jurisdiction of the Division of the State Architect that's located within the Department of General Services. So it is correct to say either the Division of the State Architect or the Department of General Services, or DGS. How does the Field Act define a school building? A school building per the Field Act is any building designed to be used for elementary or secondary school purposes, constructed, reconstructed, altered, or added to by a city, county, or any political subdivision school district within the state, or by use by the U.S. government. Per the Field Act, a leased building must meet the following requirements to be used as a school building. The building must have been constructed with seismic safety standards for commercial buildings constructed in an earthquake zone. The building permit for the initial construction of the building should have been issued on or after 1990. A structural engineer should inspect the building and submit a report to the governing board of the school district, which certifies that the building is in substantial compliance with the requirements of the Field Act. If the structural engineer attaches their seal of approval to the report, they attest that number 1, they've reviewed the design calculations, construction documents, and local government construction inspection records, and number 2, authorized testing and observed and reviewed test results and inspections of structures, welds, anchor bolts, and other structural elements. And lastly, they have observed that overhead non-structural elements, including and not limited to light fixtures, heating, and air conditioning diffusers, are braced or anchored. Per the Field Act, what happens after the structural engineer submits the report to the school district? The school district submits the report to the Division of the State Architect. Next, the Division of the State Architect has 1 month to review for compliance and provide feedback. If DSA does not respond within a month, it means that DSA concurred with the report. A final decision is then made by the governing board of the school district to proceed. What schools do not need to comply with the requirements of Article 3 of the Field Act? And what does this mean for high school students that are attending classes on other campuses not regulated by the Field Act? Private schools, Cal State universities, and University of California schools are not required to comply with the Field Act requirements. Only public elementary, secondary schools, and community colleges, K through 14. Per Article 3, 17288 of the Field Act, if a high school student attends classes on a campus of University of California or California State University, they are considered pupils of that campus and is not considered a school building per the meaning in the Field Act. Further, because those buildings are outside the Field Act and must meet other rigorous UBC Uniform Building Code standards, pupils must be notified that those buildings do not meet the requirements of Article 3 per the Field Act. Per the Department of General Services, they approve or reject all plans for construction of school buildings, or any alteration to a school whose estimated cost exceeds $100,000. Where the estimated cost of reconstruction or alteration or addition of schools exceeds $100,000 but does not exceed $225,000, what's required? A licensed structural engineer must examine if the project is a structural or non-structural alteration. If it is non-structural, a statement must be filed with the Department of General Services. If it is structural in nature, they must prepare and submit plans and specifications to the Department of General Services for review. Per the Field Act, Article 3, who is allowed to prepare plans, specifications, estimates, and observe construction? Per Article 3 of the Field Act, either a licensed architect or a licensed structural engineer is allowed to prepare plans, specifications, estimates, and observe construction. Per the Field Act, who can issue a stop order? Department of General Services, or DGS, may issue a stop work order when the construction work on a public school is not being performed with existing laws and would compromise structural integrity of a building, endangering public safety. Who's required to submit a report of the construction or alteration to the Department of General Services? A licensed architect, structural engineer, an inspector on the work, and the contractor. Each of the parties must submit a report that the work progressed per what was submitted in the construction documents, plans, and specifications. What's the role of the inspector on a school project? Per the Field Act, the role of an inspector on a school project is, number 1, they're responsible to the Department of General Services for enforcement of plans and specifications that were submitted. Number 2, the school district or jurisdiction provides and hires the inspector, which must be satisfactory to the architect or structural engineer and the Department of General Services. Number 3, the inspector is responsible to the governing board district for employment. And number 4, the inspector responds to directions from the Department of General Services, the governing board, and/or all the architect or structural engineers in responsible charge. Next, let's review the Field Act for community colleges and educational facilities, part of that same education code, this time part of Article 7. School buildings used for the community college purposes and constructed, reconstructed, altered, or added to by state, county, city, or public subdivision is defined in this article. Similar to Article 3, the Department of General Services approve and reject new construction plans or alterations exceeding $100,000. If an alteration cost is between $100,000 to $225,000, a licensed structural engineer must examine the nature of the project alteration. Under the Field Act, for primary schools, secondary schools, and community colleges, what's another term to refer to the licensed architect or structural engineer in charge? A design professional in responsible charge, or simply a design professional. Similar to Article 3 and Article 6, Article 7 mandates that the architect and structural engineer, inspector, and contractor, all three parties, to submit a report indicating work progressed per the plans and specifications submitted to DGS. When a school building is constructed and approved by DGS, what's filed? A notice of completion is filed, accounting all reports, testing, and inspection documents have been received and inspected by all parties. Next, let's review the Essential Services Building Seismic Safety Act, which is under the Health and Safety Code. The Health and Safety Code is one of 29 codes in the legislative laws in California. The goal is to provide essential services to the public after a disaster. The goal is also to design and construct in order to minimize fire hazards and to resist earthquakes, gravity, and wind loads. To do this, structural systems and details in drawings and specifications must be reviewed by enforcement agencies and the construction work inspected. When it comes to essential services buildings regulated by the Essential Services Building Seismic Safety Act, what is the intent of non-structural components? The intent is that non-structural components that are vital to the operation of essential services buildings resist earthquake, gravity, fire, and wind loads. Per the Essential Services Building Seismic Safety Act, what non-structural components must be considered? The Act lists the following. Number 1, communication systems. Number 2, main transformers. Number 3, switching equipment. Number 4, emergency backup systems. All these components must operate after a disaster. Let's dive a little deeper into each of these systems. Communication systems may include radio systems, wiring systems, phone systems, data systems, sound systems, Wi-Fi network, light controls, and intercoms. Emergency backup systems may include standby generators, uninterruptible power supply or UPS, battery backup systems, and inverters. Equipment powered by emergency power systems include elevators, exit signs, fire alarm systems, smoke dampers, and handicap doors. Any other overhead non-structural element, including lighting fixtures, sprinkler systems, ducts, and diffusers, must be considered. Let's take a detour and consider FEMA 454 Chapter 9. This flashcard will summarize additional non-structural components at risk during an earthquake and how to mitigate for each non-structural component. Number 1, suspended ceilings to provide diagonal bracing, both diagonal and vertical struts. Number 2, fluorescent lights to be supported independently from the ceiling. Number 3, heavy, full-height, non-load-bearing walls to be separated from surrounding structure to avoid transmitting forces into the wall. Number 4, partial height masonry or metal stud walls should be braced with some lateral flexibility and braced independently to the building structure. Number 5, parapets should be braced to the roof structure. Number 6, sheet metal ductwork should be braced in high seismic zones. Number 7, piping requires seismic bracing. Number 8, equipment mounted on spring vibration isolators need to be fitted with snubbers that limit lateral motion in order to prevent equipment from toppling off isolators. Number 9. Emergency power equipment batteries for emergency power. These need positive restraint where batteries can be strapped to a rack. Number 10. Tall shelving requires longitudinal bracing and attachment to the floor and to the building structure up top. Number 11. Gas water heaters need restraint to prevent them from toppling over. Provide a flexible gas connection. Who is the enforcement agency for state-owned facilities versus non-state-owned facilities under the Essential Services Building Seismic Safety Act? The Office of the State Architect is the enforcement agency for state-owned facilities or facilities leased by the state. They're in charge of reviewing design and inspecting construction. For non-state-owned buildings, the enforcement agency may be the city, county, or jurisdiction responsible. It could be any local agency. The local agency is responsible for reviewing the design and inspecting construction. What types of buildings, per the Essential Services Building Seismic Safety Act, are considered essential services buildings? Number 1, a fire station. Number 2, police station. Number 3, Emergency Operations Center. Number 4, California Highway Patrol Office. Number 5, Sheriff Office. Number 6, Emergency Communication Dispatch Center. All of these have to do with providing communication after a disaster. Per the Essential Services Building Seismic Safety Act, what building types are exempt from this act? A 1-story Type 5 and a Type 2N. N means non-fire rated. Construction that's 2,000 square feet or less in floor area is exempt from the act. Let's repeat. A 1-story Type 5 and a Type 2N construction that's 2,000 square feet or less in floor area is exempt from the act. If drawings are submitted for structural elements in existence in 1986, it requires what? If drawings are submitted for structural elements that were in existence in 1986, per the Essential Services Building Seismic Safety Act, an assessment of the geological conditions of the site and the potential for earthquake damage are required. A 1-story Type 5 and a Type 2N construction of 4,000 square feet or less are exempt from this requirement unless the project is in a special studies zone. Who prepares the drawings and specifications of an essential services building? The drawings and specifications of an essential services building is prepared under the responsible charge of the architect, structural engineer, or civil engineer, whoever signs the drawings and specifications. Observation is under the same person in responsible charge. What are the requirements of the inspector on an essential services building? Number 1. A detailed inspection must occur during construction or alteration by a qualified inspector. Number 2. Building owners should provide an inspector. And number 3. The architect, structural engineer, or civil engineer in responsible charge is qualified to inspect construction of the facility. Per the Essential Services Building Seismic Safety Act, who can issue a stop work order and why? The Department of General Services, or DGS, when work on an essential services facility is not being performed with existing law and would compromise structural integrity, may issue a stop work order. Who may need to prepare reports as the construction progresses and if the enforcement agency requires it? Per the Essential Services Building Seismic Safety Act, the architect, civil engineer, or structural engineer in responsible charge of the work may need to prepare a report, and the registered engineer, and the inspector on the work, and the contractor. What's meant by periodic review of construction by the person in responsible charge of the work? Periodic review of construction by the person in responsible charge of the work means periodic site visits to the project site of reasonable frequency for general observation of the work and test and inspection reports. What's the role of the Division of the State Architect in the Essential Services buildings? Their role is, number one, to observe and implement the chapter under the Essential Services Buildings Seismic Safety Act. Number two, establish and adopt regulations. Number three, advise local jurisdictions about the chapter. Number four, hear appeals related to this chapter. And number five, inform the Seismic Safety Commission and State Fire Marshal about implementation and administration of the chapter. What are the roles of the owner, architect, structural engineer, civil engineer, and contractor on an Essential Services Building Seismic Safety project? The architect, civil engineer, or structural engineer provides contract administration and is required to submit reports about construction progress. The owner is responsible to hire a qualified inspector. The inspector is required to submit reports about construction progress. The contractor is required to submit reports about construction progress. All reports get forwarded to the Department of General Services. Under state projects, the owner must hire a DSA qualified inspector. In the state of California, what buildings must architects provide construction administration for? Number one, Essential Services buildings under the Essential Services Buildings Seismic Safety Act. Number two, public schools per the Field Act, K through 14. And number three, acute care hospitals. Next, let's review the Alfred E. Alquist Hospital Facilities Seismic Safety Act. Under the Health and Safety Code, which is one of 29 codes of California law. It was created to prevent loss of life and protect critical systems essential for operation after an earthquake. Who regulates the design and construction of acute care hospitals? It used to be the Office of Statewide Health Planning and Development, or OSHPD. Now OSHPD is referred to as the Department of Healthcare Access and Information, HCAI. Per the Hospital Facilities Seismic Safety Act, what are owners of acute care hospitals responsible for? Owners are responsible for conducting and submitting seismic evaluations to the department. They must also identify critical non-structural systems that represent the greatest risk of failure during an earthquake and submit timetables for upgrading these systems. Also, for non-structural performance evaluation reporting, they must report all deficiencies in the non-structural performance categories elected. They must submit non-structural evaluation and deficiencies to the Department of HCAI prior to selling or leasing a hospital. What are the DSA or HCAI requirements for non-structural ceiling components? DSA requires horizontal restraint points less than 12 feet by 12 feet on center for structural reinforcement of a ceiling. HCAI requires horizontal restraint less than 8 feet by 12 feet on center for HCAI regulated projects. Which of the following is not considered an essential services building per the Essential Services Building Seismic Safety Act? As reviewed in a prior flashcard, of all the different building types, a hospital is not considered an essential services building as defined by the Essential Services Building Seismic Safety Act. Remember though, a hospital per the Seismic Safety Act must provide for essential services critical for building operation after a quake, but not, again, part of the Essential Services Building Seismic Safety Act. Review that list in the Act for building types. What's the goal of an essential services building? After a disaster, the building can be occupied immediately, and everything can function with little post-disaster remediation. If evaluating an existing building for an essential services building conversion, ensure that communication, structural, and non-structural systems are evaluated to meet the criteria established by the enforcement agency. Next, let's review the California Building Code Chapter 16, Section 1613, Earthquake Loads. It refers to ASCII 7, and 1613 is used to determine seismic design categories and seismic ground and motion values. What are the site soil property designations? Based on the site soil properties, sites are classified as A, B, C, D, E, or F per the ASCII or ASCE 7, Chapter 20. Where soil properties are unknown, site class D, E, or F must be used. Where site has rock conditions, use site class B. A equals hard rock, all the way to F, which is softer soils, or a soil that has a tendency for liquefaction. Let's define structural risk categories per this section. Risk Category 1 refers to structures with a low risk to human life, such as an agricultural building or a storage building. A Risk Category 2 refers to structures in the most common category, such as a single-family residence or standard occupancies. Risk Category 3 refers to structures with substantial risk to human life, including schools and assembly buildings. And Risk Category 4 are structures considered essential and must remain operational after disasters, such as hospitals, fire stations. Finally, let's review the Alquist-Priolo Earthquake Fault Zoning Act, or simply the Alquist-Priolo Act. This act intends to reduce losses from surface fault rupture. It was created after the destructive 1971 San Fernando earthquake, associated with extensive surface fault rupture. The Act says, where an active fault exists and has the potential for surface rupture, structures for human occupancy cannot be placed over it and must be a minimum distance from a fault, about 50 feet. And an active fault, for the purposes of the Act, is one that has ruptured in the last 11,000 years.